So I edit these pretty heavily after the fact. So you can be really rude about your colleagues and I'll take that.
Am I to take that as encouragement?
Whatever. It's a combative, your work does not seem combative, but certainly the discussions of scientism that it engenders are heated.
Yeah. Although it's quite interesting, I've been reading Hume in the Treatise again, and it's remarkable how combative he is. I mean, he really takes on the people that he regards as the opposition, and it's really slash and burn.
Yes, commit them to the flames.
Yeah, I remember that. Yes, exactly. Anyway, he's so wonderful to read.
Yeah, so we thought we'd start this off. We're going to talk for the most part about Pat's book, but you mentioned Hume a number of times in here as both a foundation of your work and as a figure that's sometimes brought up to argue that the entire point is just wrong-headed of what you're doing, that the is-ought distinction is so sharp as Hume described it that talking about brain physiology in the context of morality is useless. So we thought we'd look at a few of the quotes in here. Just as with most Hume, right? He took the first stab at it at the Treatise of Human Nature, and then some years later went back to it in the
Inquiries concerning the human understanding and concerning the principles of morals.
There you go.
And it's the principles of morals part at the end that, of course, I was mostly focusing on for this discussion. I was introduced to Hume as an undergraduate. And it seemed very reasonable and very sensible. But then, of course, as you take other classes, Hume comes in for a lot of criticism. So over the years, I looked at many other points of view so far as the origin and the nature of morality was concerned. And I kept finding myself coming back to Hume. I guess that I still do, even though I have looked hard and long at many others, including, of course, Kant and Rawls and Nozick, who I know has been a subject of discussion on your blog.
I'm almost embarrassed. That you're actually and I know I had sent you a link to an old episode. Had you listened to any of that? I'm just curious.
Yes. And no, I thought that Metcalfe's article on Nozick was really very interesting. And it was obviously very thoughtful and very well researched. And I think he opened up some really important issues. And so when I went back to look at Hume, the discussion that's most relevant to Nozick is the discussion in Book 3 on justice. And he makes it plain that it's in our interest to live together in groups and to cooperate. And we all sort of know that there are these enormous benefits that accrue to you if you live in groups, and then you have a division of labor and you can take advantage of other people's knowledge and skills and so forth. And we understand all that. And then he goes on to say, so as you grow older and as you leave childhood behind, you recognize that it's in your interest to sometimes make sacrifices for the good of the group because of the benefits of group living. And so I started thinking about Nozick in that context and how he evaluates liberty so highly. Now, of course, Hume evaluates liberty highly as well. But Hume, I think, would say to Nozick, yes, of course, that's very important. But if it is to the detriment of the group as a whole that nobody ever pay taxes, you may want to rethink that, because the stability of the group is extremely important. Now, Hume, like Hobbes, of course, was very sensitive to issues of stability because the Civil War was still very much on their mind. And it had been truly, truly horrifying. And they realized, which we sometimes, I think, don't always, that our social institutions can be very fragile, and that instabilities that undermine social institutions can be very, very destructive.
That addresses very specifically what the first chapter of your book focuses on and what seemed to be one of Hume's focuses, which is arguing against the claim from Hobbes that everybody is primarily selfish, and that's something that we just have to deal with in considering the foundations of morality, that maybe morality is something that does not come from human nature itself. Human nature is selfish, and so we need morality to protect us against our own nature or something. But you've claimed that the same mechanisms that, in fact, self-interest itself is an evolutionary leap.
Yeah.
You had described it as a system of internal balance.
Yes, that's right. And that in all organisms, there is very well-organized and well-protected circuitry for seeing to self-survival and self-well-being. And that what really changed with mammals was a sort of extension of that circuitry to the care and well-being of the offspring. And then, of course, course, over evolutionary time, as mammals spread out and found new ways of living, then other small changes took place to sort of alter the sociality in various ways. And you could think of that in terms of the expansion of the circle of people within your group.
Some people seem to, again, the libertarian camp, seem to act as if self-interest is self-evident and there's something inconceivable.
That's right.
If anybody says you're doing something altruistic, then, well, that's just because it makes them feel good or something like that. And in a sense, they're right, that it's the same brain circuitry that makes you care for yourself that is just tweaked here to expand that circle. So it's almost a redefinition of what self is, that self is not just this organism. It includes, at least in some circumstances, when, if the lion is coming to get you.
I think that's quite right. And you can see in non-human primates, such as monkeys, for example, that individuals in the group will come to the aid of a baby who has been captured by a python. And they mob the python and they hit him and they bite him and they extract the baby from the python's coils. And this is behavior that's not alien to them in the sense that it's not sort of imposed on them by an external force and their own nature is against it. It's really an expression of their nature. And of course, we see a very similar thing in the case of humans, and not just their own offspring, but also the offspring of others. And Hume actually is great on this too, because he has a passage, this is again in the section on justice, where he addresses the question of, aren't we really just selfish and the rest is imposed and alien to us? And he said, do you not see by common experience always that parents sacrifice enormously for their offspring, and that a man may garner wealth, but that he gives most of it to his children and to his wife, and he sees to their interests often before he sees to his own, and it goes on and on. Now, of course, we know that that doesn't always happen and so forth, but it's very interesting that in order to make the case for saying that cooperation and social life is very natural and not contrary to our nature, Hume starts by making that case with regard to the family. And then he says, you can see that it's in your interest to belong to a group. And slowly over time, these responses become very automatic, these responses to cooperate and to engage in group living and to sacrifice, to take a cost sometimes to yourself in order that the group as a whole may thrive. So he understood that very well. And I find that amazing, actually.
How would you contrast that kind of claim by Hume with Aristotle's the human being is a political animal and the primacy of family and that kind of thing?
Well, I think they're very close. I think Aristotle basically understood much the same thing. By political animal, I think he meant political in the broadest sense.
Yes,
I think
sure.
he meant what Hume and what I would mean by a social animal.
Mm-hmm.
And, they're very similar also, I think, in understanding that ethics is fundamentally a very practical business about solving practical problems of social life, of how we can do things in such a way as to preserve well-being, my own, but the well-being of others. And Hume makes those remarks throughout the book on morality and the treatise, but also in the Enquiry. But of course, it's all there in Aristotle. And they're similar in this other respect, which I find to be really quite interesting. And that is they both realize that social institutions of criminal justice, of enforcing contracts, of defense are not just kind of throwaway political things, but in a certain way are the essence of taking morality from being the province of a very small group to being what you need to prosper in a large group. And what's so interesting to me is that so much of contemporary moral philosophy has missed all that.
What I take is that the conventional way of thinking about these problems is what is a moral choice for an individual without paying attention to the notion that we are embedded creatures, that part of being human is being an individual and part of being human is being a part of a community, and that those aren't exclusive things.
Oh, no, they're essential. And I think actually the European philosophers understood that in a way in which the American philosophers did not.
Mm-hmm.
That is, that part of who you are and makes you the person that you are and gives you the kind of quality of life that you can have is being a member of the group and having a role in the group and learning the group conventions and practices and then learning to improve upon those conventions and practices. And of course, the problem was that when the Europeans talked about those things, they made it sound so weird and woolly and difficult and obscure that people would just sort of throw the book down and say, oh, to hell with it. And you'd go back to the clarity of somebody like John Rawls. But Rawls, I think, didn't really get to the heart of the matter.
Well, that's interesting. I usually think of Nietzsche, who has, I think, a very similar ethical view in terms of let's look at what human nature actually is. And there really is no normativity other than what comes from our own impulses or how we deal with other people. But yet he never made that leap to explicitly, at least being systematic about the political, because the political is big and scary. Sharing with maybe the way American philosophers often think about ethics, that the essence of the moral situation is I right now as an individual am in some situation, maybe I'm in chains, maybe I'm in a concentration camp.
That's right.
It doesn't matter how unfree my situation is, but what it is my duty to do in that situation, as opposed to this state building, which even back to Plato's Republic, those were considered, those problems go hand in hand. You can't even really talk about the virtues of the individual without talking about the virtues of the state.
Yeah, no, that's right. And Hume certainly understood the importance of institutions, but certainly clearly so did Aristotle. And they thought that a good deal of our sort of moral efforts ought to go into trying to figure out what kinds of institutions would promote prosperity and stability and what kinds of institutions would undermine them. And that is, I think, an important part of the contemporary, very public conversation right now about morality. And the case in point really has to do with the drug laws. The drug laws that came about as a result of the war on drugs and all that stuff have been a source of absolutely horrendous grief and misery. And of course, as this new report has shown, this war on drugs has been a colossal failure. And so part of what we have to do now is sort of figure out, well, then what should we do? This is a huge moral consequence.
I agree, but it's interesting that you pick that example because I think it crystallizes the conflict about what morality is, in that on the other side of that, you have people saying, well, taking drugs is just wrong. And so you have maybe it's a kind of universalism, but it's a notion that that kind of moral distinction is writ in stone, and you appeal to something outside of something like a pragmatic sussing out of what would be beneficial compromise or solution to a many-valued problem between individual activity and group activity.
No, I think that is an important moral domain. I don't want to suggest that the only important moral domain has to do with public institutions that affect us all, because, of course, on a day-by-day basis, each of us does make decisions, and often they are consequential in terms of the prosperity and misery and well-being of others. So I don't think that's a conflict, but I think you're right to say that when you think about something like the drug laws, you want to take many, many things into account. That includes the consequences of having a war on drugs that causes a lot of misery and is inefficacious and is very expensive. So you ask, are there better ways of doing things? And I think that's as moral a question as some of the questions that arise for an individual. Should I blow the whistle on Mrs. X, for example? So they're all part of our moral life. It's just that, if you're living 200,000 years ago in a small group, you have a very different set of moral questions than you do if you live in a hugely complex society as ours is.
So to give a contrast to the way we've talked about this on this podcast before, we had a discussion of Kant's ethics. He insisted that morality comes direct from reason. It has to be a categorical imperative. It has to imply in all circumstances, regardless of what your individual desires are. And of course, he had read Hume and is reacting specifically to this. And Hume's position, on the other hand, was that it's all hypothetical. We can still talk about what you should do and what laws we should pass, but it's really based on consistency with what you already find yourself believing, right?
Well, up to a point. For Hume, and I think this is also true of how I see it now that we know something about the neurobiology, For Hume, there is the moral sentiment. And what that does is provides a disposition so that you will consider certain kinds of alternatives, that you will find certain options unacceptable and others okay. But the moral sentiment in and of itself doesn't provide answers to moral questions. It sort of puts you into the space of moral reasons, if you like. And once you're there, then facts are important, memories, what other people think, history, and all this comes together in a certain way to help you make a decision about what you ought to do. Where Hume and Kant differ really, I think, is with regard to this fundamental moral platform. And Hume is sometimes read quite wrongly, I think, as being a sort of simple, if your guts tell you do X, do X. And of course, that's clearly not so. He's not a simple emotivist in any sense at all. And he goes on in many places to talk about how reason can actually provoke a moral response, or that it can stimulate a particular moral passion to do this or to do that. So he knows that the story is going to be very complex. And I fancy that the very vague account that I have of constraint satisfaction as a process whereby nervous systems light on a solution is the kind of thing that would have appealed to Hume. And I think constraint satisfaction is something that we can roughly understand in all animal decision making, even rats, where the variables are very well controlled. But I think it also seems to be something about the way humans make decisions as well, whether those decisions are made very quickly and automatically, or whether they are made over many days as one struggles to sort of find a good resolution. But I think constraint satisfaction is what's going on. And that means it's not just reason in the sense of deduction. There's all kinds of perceptions and emotions and memories and so forth.
Well, if I substituted the word judgment for constraint satisfaction, where I understood judgment, broadly speaking, is not merely satisfying the outputs of, for lack of a better term, reason in my brain, but understood it as being the weighing of all kinds of unspeakable things. Would that be congruous to what you're talking about?
Yeah, I think it is. It's just that the judgment is sort of the outcome of the constraint satisfaction process.
Sure. Okay. I guess I was thinking of the judgment muscle maybe, or the activity. Okay. And I don't want to, saying it that way, I don't want to say that there's a neurobiological muscle out there.
I take your point. But I mean, in all animals, we see that when they need to make a decision, there is some sort of process that goes on where their immediate perception and what they've learned and various other factors sort of come to bear. And it's as though the brain sort of goes into a local minimum. The decision is made and the rat makes its choice, or the monkey or the person or what have you. I mean, part of the problem too is that Hume, when he is sort of expressing skepticism about the role of reason in morality, he means by reason there deduction, and likens it to the kind of certainty that you get with algebra and geometry. But of course, he also knows that there is this other thing that we also sometimes call reasoning, or which Peirce would have called abduction, whereby you make an inference to the best decision.
Yes.
And that's what you think of, I think, as judgment.
That's what I'm thinking of. And I had a question about that in the way in which that judgment worked with respect to, I'm thinking of what the notion of expectation is in general, that allows for predictive behavior. So that when you make a judgment, you also have implicit assumptions about what's going to happen in the dynamics. And so some of that is going to be from habit and experience. You drop the ball, it goes down all the time, that kind of thing. And others are going to have to do with the kind of social things that you speak about in your book, that you learn those things. And I guess the way in which that works that I'm most interested in is that however this works, it allows for refinement of that predictive power so that you come up with different conclusions. So that there's something like figuring out that results in a new conclusion that wasn't there before.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's right. And we don't really understand that process very well. It's probably got analogs in reasoning about the physical world, where somebody is using a tool and then it occurs to them that if they made a slight adjustment, it would work better this way and that way. I think it's the same kind of process. And suddenly, you started off with just a sharp rock, and then after a few modifications, you have it tied to a stick, and now you've got a spear that you can use to catch fish. And we do that in the moral domain as well. But that sort of creativity, of course, humans are extraordinarily good at. We see it to a degree in animals also, especially primates.
Well, let me ask this question in sort of a moral context. You might acknowledge, okay, back in 500 BC, as part of their social structure, slaves were an intrinsic part of it. But what we can do is we can say, okay, look, we know slavery is wrong and that they could have known that then and they just made a mistake. Another way of saying it would be that, well, based upon their social structure and so forth, I guess the question of its wrongness across that time could be more complicated. And I would contrast that with something like our disposition with respect to sunburns. That now the convention is that you go out in the sun and you wear sunscreen. And there's a sense that, getting a tan is not necessarily in general very healthy. And that was not true 30 years ago. Smoking would be another example where it's not quite so clearly moral in the way slavery is, even if people can have a kind of moralism about it. But there's a different set of standards and judgments that have developed. And we wouldn't be uncomfortable in the case of smoking or in the case of suntanning to say, well, people just thought differently back then. And we think differently now, and there's no big whoop about that.
Yes.
But with slavery, we would feel differently about that. The universalism would come out in the argument. And so I was wondering if you had any thoughts about the notion of the way in which morals may change based upon social circumstances over time, because that's where a lot of the kind of fist pumping and table banging comes in this.
No, I think you're right. There has been a sort of scapegoating of the notion of relativism in a way that has masked important things about social behavior. Obviously, we don't want to say that something is right if someone thinks it's right. We can't go that direction. On the other hand, and actually Philip Kitcher's very good on this point, and he said, don't use the word relativism, use the word pluralism as a way of acknowledging that relative to certain ecological conditions and relative to certain needs and the traditions that people have and the history of where they are, a certain practice may be one that from our particular vantage point and level of prosperity, we think is wrong. We can still say that their practice is wrong, but without condemning it in a way that makes us look arrogant and smug and foolish. But there are other kinds of cases that I think are a little bit different. If you think about the practice of infanticide, which was practiced very widely in all cultures until very recently, and actually still in some cultures is practiced quite a lot. I mean, amongst the Inuit, to take the easiest example, where they always lived on the knife edge of survival, every year was a fight against starvation. It was not unreasonable if they had too many mouths to feed and yet another girl was born to feel sad and regretful, but to let it go.
Yep.
Now, if the only alternative is that everybody starves, then you can understand why there was such a practice. But it's also important to realize the practice was not one that people took great joy and delight in. I mean, they didn't toss the baby into the ocean and laugh about it or anything of that kind.
It wasn't based on desirability. It was based upon a
necessity.
kind of judgment.
And I think in the case of slavery in Greece, of course, it was a very, very different institution from slavery as we knew it in, let's say, Alabama or Mississippi. And often slaves were freed. They were often educated. They were treated with quite a lot of respect. So you can look at Aristotle with his slaves and you think, oh, how dreadful. But if you actually take the time to put it in the context of what life was like for those slaves and their expectations and the style of life that people led then, you back off condemning it as something that is just horrendous. It wasn't horrendous. And I am betting that every table-thumping abolitionist who lived in Athens at that time with that set of social practices would have had slaves. We like to think that our knowledge is so deep and that we are so good that we never would have. I'm betting you would have. At least I'm betting I would have.
Well, it's a little bit like every time people think about living in the past, they always imagine themselves as being part of royalty rather than one of the serfs.
That's sort of right. And even I think in the recent past, when one thinks about attitudes that men have had towards women, and you think, well, like I had a wonderful mathematics teacher in high school, and he did this very generous thing of holding calculus classes after school for the few of us who were going on to college, except that he wouldn't let any of the girls take the class on grounds that we wouldn't be able to do calculus. Now, I still love the guy. He was a wonderful teacher. He was mixed up about that. I'm sure he changed his mind after he had 5 daughters. But,
Did you send him your book after Neurophilosophy, this giant thick tome?
Yeah. And so I can't bring myself to condemn him. I think he was wrong about that. Okay, fine. Enough said.
Yeah, I think this pluralism makes more sense to me when you're taking the approach that you're taking, that Hume taking, which I guess I'd call a bottom-up approach rather than a top-down approach, that we're not looking for universal rules, even when moral philosophers turned away from specifically trying to figure out what the scripture says should be the rules for everybody. And when they made the turn to, like Locke say, of let's justify these things through reason instead, they were still had the top-down paradigm, the divine command paradigm driving them.
Oh, I think so.
A lot of what you're saying in terms of how reason can inform moral judgments and how the complexities enter. And as you said, they turn into arguments about facts. And I want to make sure we hit that. I mean, you can say you can't get values strictly from facts. In fact, folks that have, their brains can be working perfectly well in terms of the way that they understand facts. Mm-hmm. But if the part of their brain that drives the valuing is not working correctly, they can be psychopathic.
Absolutely.
I don't want to oversimplify this, as you were warning against, and say, well, whatever desires you have, that's what morality is. I mean, that's certainly oversimplified.
Clearly not so. That's clearly wrong.
But that's the foundation, right? That you have to start with what purposes people actually find themselves having. Mm-hmm. And then it's just a matter that they have to live in a society. And so if their purposes, if some of them are rather antisocial and at cross purposes with each other, then by the fact that they're living together, they're forced to, what sort of laws are we going to come up with? Well, unless I'm the absolute tyrant, I can't have it reflect solely my often selfish desires.
Yeah, that's right. Although Hume makes a claim that everybody has a moral sentiment. In an interesting way, he was right, and in another way, he was wrong. I mean, the right part of it is that it does look like normally, if an infant is loved and reared in a loving environment and is not abused and so forth, that they grow up with very normal social responses. That is, they are disposed to cooperate, to help, to be generous, to care about other people. Mm-hmm. And there's some evidence, but I mean, this is still really early days, but there is some evidence that psychopathy is linked to abuse as a child. If the child just doesn't get cuddling and nurturing and love when it's an infant, or if it's beaten up and so forth later. And I think that's really quite an interesting thing, that sociality is so strong that it really takes quite a lot in order to sort of change the wiring to make the person different.
Right. When you're saying it's early, you're saying that we don't know a lot about the mechanisms that make that possible, and have the experimental documentation of, well, let's have a control group that treats their kids normally.
That's
and
right.
Can you 12 people abuse your kids from their birth, and then we'll measure, we can.
I mean, what you know from rat studies is that if you take the pups when they're born, take them from the mother so that she doesn't do the usual things, which involves a lot of licking and there's her warm body and so forth. You take them away, you feed them, you keep them warm, and they do grow up with a different neural chemistry. That is, their oxytocin and vasopressin organization is different. And socially, their behavior is different. They don't carry on properly. They don't mate properly. They don't take care of their own pups properly. And this has provoked the research on humans to see whether or not there is anything comparable. And there's not much data so far, but for what it's worth, there was quite a large study done on two groups of women. One group who had a very normal upbringing, got the usual cuddling and nurturing as infants and had a loving family. The other group consisted of women who were routinely neglected as infants and who were abused. And of course, the behavioral differences you can easily understand, but when they did the oxytocin levels differences, they found a significant difference. Biochemistry is going to be affected by environment. And when the environment is typical in the sense that it's social in the normal way, you'll get one effect. But if it's very atypical, you're going to get a different social behavior.
It's even stronger than that, right? It's not just the biochemistry, but the biochemical development. So the infrastructure that gets developed that results in hormone dispersion is socially affected. So that's an interesting hard piece, or potentially hard piece of evidence regarding the significance of nurture, so to speak.
I think it is. I think it's tremendously important. And that nurturing in the very first days turns out to be really important. At least we know this in rats. We don't know this in humans, but it turns out to be very important for the density of oxytocin receptors in particular places. Genes just don't express oxytocin receptors until the environment, or unless the environment has a certain feature, namely this touching and licking and so forth.
One question I have about this kind of thing is one dimension about morality would be the way in which we include others as us. And so broadly speaking, there's a way in which we say, well, human beings are all somehow fundamentally alike, and that's one reason why we apply laws to our judgments to human beings. And then we come up against this problem that some people, we easily acknowledge, while they're human beings, they have diminished capacities that just require us to treat them differently. And there are easy examples of that. But these examples that you just talked about, where you might be able to point to quantitative differences between individual human beings, and you could, with some reliability, say, look, they're hardwired differently. How should we sort of deal with that growing amount of information that allows us to make these somehow micro distinctions between people that are more than, oh, your skin's different, you're taller, you're shorter, stuff like that. You'd want to feel like, well, these are more substantive changes. You'd see these questions in like criminal justice. So-and-so, he's got real brain chemistry issue. What kind of accountability do we want to have? Other kinds of issues that fall under the umbrella of morality.
Yeah, I mean, these are really, really difficult questions. In part, my response is this, that the most important part of the information that's coming out about the bad effects of hitting and spanking and abusing kids, the most important part of that has to do with prevention and making it broadly known to people that there are ways of teaching self-discipline to kids that don't involve beating them up. But then your question is, okay, but so suppose we have a population of people, and let's just, for the sake of argument, call them psychopaths. And let's say that they don't feel remorse, they don't feel social pain, they are manipulative and exploitative and very dangerous, but it's not their fault. Here, I really do go back to Aristotle. The law is there for a very practical reason. Mm-hmm. The law, the criminal justice system is there to serve social safety, civility, and stability. Mm-hmm. And that if people have done something horrendous and they can't be treated, then we have to be protected from them, regardless of whether or not it's their fault. So if someone, likes to torture children, let us suppose, and is a psychopath and gets a certain amount of pleasure out of this and does it, within the confines of the criminal justice system, we're really interested in three things. Did he do it? Can he be treated? And will he do it again? And if he can't be treated, we are pretty sure he's going to do it again. Then you have to put him in a place where he can't harm others. Considerations like, but it's not his fault, are really not relevant.
That makes utter, complete practical sense to me. And I don't have any issue with it. I'm just trying to think about the different ways in which the notion of accountability, those extreme examples are in some ways a lot easier. The whole notion of what punishment is at all comes to the fray, the notion of what it means to have justice and whether punishment is involved in justice at all, or whether justice really is more of this practical notion that we are individuals and we are social animals. In belonging to a community, even if we ignore some notion of a social contract that the individual makes, put that off to the side. Just say, along with Aristotle, that we're social animals, that you have these sort of requirements that are both individual but also community upon these constraints.
I kind of want to dispel the specter of Hume here before we continue diving deep into your book. So let me read the notorious quote that's at the end of Treatise, Book 3, Section 1. This is the is-ought distinction thing. In every system of morality with which I have hitherto met with, I have always remarked that the author proceeds for some time in the ordinary way of reasoning and establishes the being of a god or makes observations concerning human affairs, when of a sudden I am surprised to find that instead of the usual copulations of propositions is and is not, I meet with no proposition that is not concerned with an ought or an ought not. The change is imperceptible, but is, however, of the last consequence. For as this ought or ought not expresses some new relation or affirmation, 'tis necessary that should be observed and explained, and at the same time a reason should be given, for what seems altogether inconceivable, how this new relation can be a deduction from others, which are entirely different from it.
Yeah, and the critical word is deduction. And what he thinks, and he's absolutely right, is that they imagine that they have a deduction, a logically valid argument, and it's obvious to him that they don't have a deduction. And indeed, he's right to say you can never get a logically valid argument that takes you from what is to what ought to be. On the other hand, the rest of the treatise, and indeed earlier parts of that section, make it clear that we do come to draw inferences about what we ought to do on the basis of this moral sentiment that we have and our assessment of the consequences of an action. And so there are a number of places where he talks about, for example, he'll say reason and judgment may be the immediate cause of an action by prompting or by directing a passion. So what he's really objecting to there is not that you can never infer an ought from an is, but that you can never go by deduction from an is to an ought. And of course, he's right.
The paradigm that he's working against here is evaluating the truth value. Actually, I shouldn't even say, because this is more modern language than him, but evaluating the truth value of moral claims, right? So we want to say the sentence, it is wrong to kill. Is that a true statement or is that a false statement? I mean, is that whole way of thinking about analyzing moral claims in this linguistic way, is that just foreign to you and foreign to Hume as far as you're concerned?
Well, I think Hume is very, very subtle on this point of truth and falsity. I mean, he makes the observation that it is just a fact that you have a certain feeling towards an action. But then he also goes on to say that sometimes we can see that having that feeling towards that action should be altered by reason. And there he doesn't mean by deduction. He means by additional perceptions and memories and by the role of experience and learning and so forth.
But it's not changing the underlying moral intuition. Reason, according to him, has two roles in here. It's about means-ends analysis, and it's about determining facts of the matter, right? That's where the faculty of reason, according to him, comes in. So whatever the underlying normative claim, maybe it's just that human welfare is good, where that means something slightly specific, something that we understand. Human health is good, and not just my human health is good, that there's something there that cannot fundamentally be argued for. If you built a robot that had all the reasoning capacities, but did not have that as its underlying assumption, you could do no moral reasoning with it. But once that very basic thing is established, then 90% of the work in morality is going to be about applying this very basic thing.
Absolutely. And so that's why I said in the earlier section that the moral sentiment for Hume, or for me, this disposition to sociality, can express itself in various social practices or decisions, but that given the complexity of the social world, the moral sentiment itself doesn't tell you that you should choose this option as opposed to that option. Mm-hmm. And that's where, of course, reason in the sense of using perception and memory and experience comes into play. The passage just before the one that you read is really quite interesting, because when he talks about not getting morality out of the facts, he means out of the facts of the object or the action that somebody else might do. But he says, here is a matter of fact, but it's the object of feeling, not reason. It lies, and I think this is just quintessential Hume, it lies in yourself, not in the object. So it's the fact within yourself that you have this pro-social feeling that provides the basis for then doing the cognitive work of figuring out, should you cooperate in this instance or should you refrain? Should you help, or would that incur unwanted obligations? Should you be generous to this person, but maybe they're a thief? That's when all that stuff comes in. In a way, what you're saying is absolutely right. All the hard work of figuring out what kinds of things should guide our social practices has to be done basically through cognition. But see, there Hume is very interesting, and he sees it as a form of problem solving. And so he says, look, of course you want to have an institution of promise keeping because it serves everybody very well. And you want to be able to count on certain kinds of things. And in order to count on them, you have to be able to expect that a person will keep their promise, or if they don't, that they will be held accountable. So that's just practical stuff. And he thinks that that kind of reasoning is really what takes you from this pro-social attitude towards other people to negotiating with them and working together to build institutions that serve the prosperity of the group. What you can't do is try to hew out a rule that is exceptionless, that applies to all people under all circumstances and at all times, because that violates, as he would say, that violates common sense.
As a point of comparison, how does this reflection about starting with what are the facts of our moral sentiments, thinking of them as psychological facts and sort of trying to build them into a coherent system and apply them to social engineering, how does that compare with, say, W.D. Ross's? So we've got all these moral intuitions. They're all defeasible intuitions, right? They can overrule each other in various ways. But Ross sounds a lot like, in some ways, the guys that Hume was arguing against. Hume mentions specifically folks that would take a concept like gratitude and say that's just a fitting response to beneficence, that they're looking at the concepts in themselves and saying, I'm using my faculty of reason to say that this concept just fits with another. And from there, we can get moral rules. It seems like Ross is doing something similar to that like, look, just intuition gives us up these, it's wrong to hurt people unless you have a good reason. And it's you have an obligation to help people unless you have a good reason.
Well, I think it's just more complicated than that. And of course, the thing about intuitions is they're not kind of pipelines from the deep moral truths. I mean, they are responses that are automatic, that come about as a result of the socialization we receive as children. So certain people will have an intuition of one kind and somebody else from another culture will have a very different one. And I'm sure Ross was aware of all that. So it's not that one wants to discount intuitions. And Hume is very clear on this also, that sometimes your automatic responses should be reconsidered. And sometimes what you think you ought to do changes as a result of reevaluating the situation. Social decision-making is just very, very complicated and relies a lot on things we call conscience or intuitions. But that's all kind of structured. That's all superstructure on this basic disposition for sociality.
I think you can acknowledge that intuitions are flawed and that even fundamental intuitions, you might later reevaluating them, but you could say still that's the only starting point we have. That ultimately, if we're going to reevaluate these things, it's because our intuitions ultimately conflict with each other. It's because when we think out the long-term consequences. So it's going from what do you want right now to what do you really want? That's the only direction we can go.
I think something like that. If you didn't have the disposition for sociality, you wouldn't have certain kinds of intuitions. Absolutely.
Well, and also, I mean, isn't it going to be the case that some of your intuitions are born out of the influence of, say, the way you grew up? This goes back to my question of predictability and that your intuitions, they're not raw.
Oh, no, they're not wrong. That's absolutely.
So they're going to come along with baggage about context and expectation that lead to judgments that might be different than if you had a different set of baggage that came along with those intuitions. I
think that's actually a very deep point, because nervous systems, I mean, here's sort of a simple way of thinking about nervous systems, but the nervous systems are fundamentally in the business of moving the body in order to get resources and to reproduce. And in order to enhance movement and make it more efficient or more successful, you want to be able to predict. And you can look at the evolution of the brain from very simple jellyfish right up to humans as fundamentally about getting better and better at being able to predict and being able to have a more successful set of behaviors so that you can succeed in what Paul MacLean used to call the 4 Fs: feeding, fleeing, fighting, and reproducing. And so when you say that your social intuitions are kind of encrusted with or shot through with predictive characters, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. Your intuition about somebody in the bus being a little bit weird, you're drawing on a background of experience that you can't even articulate, and it has to do with a prediction about what somebody doing that kind of thing might do.
It sounds like you would also agree that the desires for higher level things that we have, or something like intellectual desire, the wanting that we have for intangible things, maybe even something like justice, that those ultimately point back to the kinds of bodily desires that we have. Plato, in the Symposium, Socrates explains that desire for philosophy is essentially erotic desire grown up. And that there just be sort of an acknowledgement, oh, that's just true. That evolutionarily, we've replaced somehow, and it'd be interesting to understand more about exactly how that displacement happens. But the kinds of desire we have, when we feel bodily desire for justice, that's because we have hormones going off in our bodies related directly to desire in that respect.
I think so. And it's all very complex, and I wouldn't want to be misunderstood as saying that something like justice can just be said to be a reflection of estrogen levels or something like that. Obviously not.
No.
But on the other hand, when people do feel things like moral outrage, then that's fundamentally a brain response. And it's a response that has to do with how you were first put together, and then how, in the context of your environment, there was learning and gene expression and more learning and more gene expression and so forth.
But if we're going to analyze what that reaction is, I mean, certainly there's a physiological component, but whatever the physiological component is, you can also describe it in terms of what is the logic of the emotion itself? What is it directed at? And do some kind of non-physiological analysis to see if that moral outrage makes any sense. Is it directed at the appropriate thing? Mm-hmm. Right. I guess that's what I think a lot of philosophy people listening to this will have some impatience that, okay, we know that there's a neural correlate, say, for any given emotion. Why do we have to care about which correlate exactly it is? This is the big question for you. Why do the details matter here?
Yeah, no, I think that is a very interesting question. And I can only answer it in a way by saying why it matters to me. And that is that I have, until just very recently, been just very puzzled by Hume's idea of the moral sentiment, or puzzled about where values really come from. I mean, how does it come to be that people value justice so greatly and are willing to make great sacrifices for it? How can that be? And hitherto, I think the models that evolutionary biologists have developed to try to explain altruism in terms of kin selection and so forth have been really very unsatisfying, not because I think they were wrong so much as that I couldn't see what the role of the brain was. I mean, there has to be a story there. So for me, understanding the evolution of the mammalian brain, and probably this is true of birds as well, understanding that in terms of behavior that expands self-maintenance and care of one's own well-being to care for others, in the first analysis for offspring, but care also for kin and affiliates. It seemed to me to provide a very satisfying link to evolutionary biology and to what we know about the way the brain works and the evolution of the brain. And it gave me a kind of foundation for then looking at the more difficult questions about the criminal justice system as we know and love it now. Mm-hmm. But what I've also found in my travels and giving talks on this topic is that people find it reassuring in two ways. One is that so values aren't just magical. They aren't just somehow we have this pipeline to Plato's heaven or that they come from God or something. That, I think, is the first thing. And the second thing I think that people say to me is, well, then we have to think about values in a different way. And the conviction I have that my value with regard to, let's say, liberty is unshakable and right, and you can't challenge it, maybe I have to just kind of rethink this a little bit. Or